General Hospital will reveal Lois had long cultivated the image of a strong-willed, fiercely loyal woman who would go to any lengths to protect those she loved. To the public eye, she was the resilient matriarch, the protector of Brooklyn and the unwavering advocate for family unity. But beneath that surface lay a steely resolve sharpened by years of buried resentment she harbored toward a man she had never truly forgiven, Dante. While others may have danced around the issue, Lois had no illusions about how deeply she distrusted him. She remembered the day Brooklyn came home pregnant, still a teenager, with her future turned upside down and Dante offering nothing but a feeble excuse for distance. In Lois's eyes, he had abandoned his responsibility and left her daughter to suffer the fallout alone. And now, years later, when the painful truth about Gio exploded in front of the entire town during the nurses' ball, Lois did not see a tragedy to mourn, she saw an opportunity to strike. When Gio stood on that stage, humiliated and unraveling, his eyes shimmering with heartbreak and betrayal, Lois didn't merely see a wounded boy, she saw the cost of Dante's silence. As Gio smashed his violin and condemned both Brooklyn and Dante as parents who had never wanted him, the crowd gasped in horror, but Lois remained still, her expression unreadable. Brooklyn wept. Dante looked shell-shocked, and Gio descended into chaos. But Lois's mind was already calculating the next move. To her, this wasn't just an accident of fate. It was the culmination of years of missteps by a man who had been coddled and forgiven too often. The time had come to make sure he would never be granted that grace again. Lois's campaign against Dante didn't begin with rage, it began with precision. She initiated subtle, targeted interventions meant to isolate him within the very family he once thought of as his anchor. To Gio, she whispered carefully chosen truths, each one crafted to deepen the wedge between father and son. She reminded him, without ever seeming forceful, that Dante had never looked for him, never fought to be a part of his life. Never once imagined that the child he left behind might one day grow up to be someone who deserved the truth. She did not lie, Lois never lied, but she bent the truth expertly, suggesting that Brooklyn had been pushed into secrecy not out of selfishness, but out of necessity because she could not trust Dante to step up. With each passing day, Gio grew colder toward his biological father, and Lois made sure to be the comforting presence he needed, the one adult who never failed him. Every word of comfort she offered was laced with undertones designed to steer Gio further away from reconciliation. Brooklyn, meanwhile, struggled with guilt and the overwhelming task of mending the rift with her son. But even she could not escape Lois's influence. When Brooklyn questioned whether she should defend Dante to Gio, Lois calmly shut it down, reminding her of every tear she had cried alone in the past, every insult she had suffered for loving someone who never fought for her. It became easier for Brooklyn to remain silent, to distance herself from Dante, all while unknowingly helping Lois construct the narrative of a father who had failed not just once, but perpetually. But Lois didn't stop there. She knew that Dante's connection to Lulu remained a potential threat, an avenue through which he might find emotional solace or clarity. So she set her sights on severing that, too. The nurse's ball debacle had given her all the ammunition she needed. Lulu had revealed the secret of Joe's parentage on stage, in front of the entire town, robbing the boy of any dignity or private reckoning. To Lois, it was a breathtakingly selfish move disguised as righteous honesty. She ensured that Dante would never forget that betrayal. Every time Lulu reached out to explain, to apologize, Lois was there, not to scold, but to remind Dante of the pain on Joe's face, of the public humiliation that had spiraled from Lulu's actions. She emphasized that Lulu had known the truth for weeks, had consulted with Carly, Laura, and Cody before even speaking a word to Dante himself. Lois painted a picture of someone who saw Dante not as a partner, but as a narrative pawn, someone she could manipulate to enhance her own heroic return to relevance. Privately, Lois began to leak this version of events to key figures in Port Charles, allowing rumors to build that Lulu had orchestrated the reveal for her own gain. She let it slip that Lulu had always wanted the nurse's ball moment to be about her triumphant redemption as a truth-teller. Conveniently forgetting the emotional fallout it would bring to a young man just discovering his life had been a fabrication. Through whispers and veiled conversations, Lois created an atmosphere of doubt, making it harder for Dante to believe in Lulu's intentions, and easier for him to recoil from her entirely. All of this was done with an almost frightening calm. Lois never raised her voice, never confronted anyone outright. She didn't have to. Her power lay in her ability to control perception, to manipulate the emotional current of the people around her until they were swept exactly where she wanted them to go. And as Dante's world began to collapse, from his estranged relationship with Gio, to the crumbling trust between him and Brooke Lynn, and the irreversible damage to his bond with Lulu, Lois watched silently, knowing every step had brought her closer to her goal. She told herself it wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was what any mother would do if they saw the man who once broke their daughter's heart now standing in the way of healing a grandchild's. But deep down, even Lois knew this was personal. This wasn't just about Gio. It wasn't just about Brooke Lynn. This was about years of bitterness. Of watching Dante be praised while Brooke Lynn suffered. This was about never having the chance to say what she really thought of him, until now. Now, she had all the power. And she would not rest until Dante Falconeri was no longer seen as the honorable detective or the misunderstood father. She would see to it that everyone finally saw him the way she always had. As the boy who ran from responsibility, and the man who never deserved her daughter, or her grandson. While chaos engulfed every corner of Port Charles in the wake of Joe's emotional collapse. And as loved ones scrambled to find a way to stabilize the fractured boy, Lois quietly orchestrated the final phase of her long-brewing strategy, the complete isolation of Dante. Her plan was no longer just about shielding Brooke Lynn from criticism or cushioning Gio from further pain. It had evolved into something far more deliberate and ruthless, a mission she now dubbed, protecting her grandson at all costs. But beneath that noble-sounding phrase lay a deeper and more calculated motive. Reshaping the narrative of Dante from a once sympathetic father into a symbol of parental failure in the eyes of his own son. Knowing that she could not achieve this alone, Lois turned to the one person whose heart was even more vulnerable than Joe's, Brooke Lynn. Consumed by guilt and desperate to reconnect with the son she never had the chance to raise. Brooke Lynn was emotionally fragile, overwhelmed by regret, and teetering on the edge of surrender. Lois seized upon this vulnerability with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding every corner of her daughter's heart. She didn't demand obedience, Lois never had to. She simply offered support, empathy, and the illusion of maternal wisdom. She convinced Brooke Lynn that the only way to heal Gio was to validate his pain. Even if that meant standing silently as he hurled accusations, even if it meant re-examining every choice made since the day she learned she was pregnant. At first, Brooke Lynn believed she was finally doing right by her son, being honest, accepting blame, trying to meet him where he was. But slowly, insidiously, Lois began to guide those conversations. Always tilting the balance of culpability toward Dante. She would say things like, if he had been there, none of this would have happened, or maybe if he hadn't walked away. You wouldn't have had to lie. Brooke Lynn, still overwhelmed by her need to repair the damage, never realized that her growing silence in defense of Dante was exactly what Lois wanted. In her mind, agreeing with her mother's framing of the past felt like solidarity. She never noticed how that agreement steadily eroded any path toward redemption for the man who once shared her most private grief. In front of Gio, the pattern became increasingly clear. Brooke Lynn began to say things like, I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid of what your father would say. Or, I didn't think he'd want to be part of your life. These weren't accusations, but they planted seeds, seeds that Lois was more than happy to water. To Gio, already drowning in the betrayal of discovering his life had been a carefully constructed lie, these subtle suggestions felt like confirmation of his deepest fears, that he was an unwanted mistake. Passed off to others not because of circumstance, but because of indifference. And in those quiet moments when Lois would comfort him, gently reinforcing those thoughts, she was doing something far more potent than protecting him. She was reshaping his entire perception of who his father was. Meanwhile, Dante's attempts to explain himself became increasingly futile. He tried to speak to Gio, to tell him about his own pain, his confusion, his ignorance of the truth. But by then, it didn't matter. Gio had already internalized a version of events where Dante was the root of every ache, every lie, every absence. Brooklyn's silence in these confrontations only deepened the wound. The more Dante spoke, the more it seemed like he was trying to rewrite history, and the more Lois's narrative, of a man who ran from responsibility and only returned when forced to, took root. Even those close to Dante began to fall quiet. Not because they lacked faith in him, but because Lois had subtly reframed the entire situation as one where loyalty to Gio meant silence in the face of Dante's excuses. Any defense of Dante began to sound like a dismissal of Joe's pain. And so friends and family chose to withhold their words, believing that this too might be a way of supporting the child they all felt had been wronged. But Lois knew better. She knew that silence was just as damning as condemnation, and she weaponized it expertly. The more isolated Dante became, the less power his voice held. Every argument he made fell into the void. Unanswered, unwelcome, and ultimately irrelevant. In the space of just a few weeks, Lois had managed to turn a fragile family crisis into a quiet civil war, where the battleground was not loud or explosive but emotional and internal. Brooklyn and Gio, now aligned in their pain, became impervious to Dante's pleas. Lulu, still reeling from her own mistakes, lacked the credibility to mediate. And everyone else, those who might once have come to Dante's defense, simply stepped back, uncertain. Manipulated into believing that perhaps, this time, he really had failed too deeply to be forgiven. Lois, watching it all unfold from the sidelines, maintained her calm, matriarchal exterior. She never raised her voice, never demanded revenge. She simply let her truths be known, softly, persistently, always positioned as a protective act. But in truth, she had executed a ruthless social and emotional excommunication, dismantling Dante's place in the family structure without ever appearing to strike a single blow. To the outside world, she was just a loving grandmother trying to help her family through a dark chapter. But behind the scenes, she had written the ending to a story where Dante would no longer be welcome. No longer needed, no longer trusted. And she had done it with surgical precision, because for Lois, love and vengeance were never mutually exclusive. What had once seemed destined to be a deeply moving reunion, a long overdue reconciliation between father and son, between lovers who once burned for each other with unspoken passion, was now smothered under the weight of calculated manipulations and ancient wounds that had never truly healed. The narrative had shifted. What should have been a story of second chances and emotional redemption had become an intricate maze of mistrust, where every path toward peace had been blocked not by explosive revelations, but by quiet, corrosive doubt. Gio, caught in the center of this emotional tempest, had become a fractured version of himself. Once confident and filled with potential, he now moved like a shadow, suspended in a limbo of identity crisis. His heart, bruised and disoriented, teetered between two dangerous extremes, simmering resentment toward those who had lied to him, and an aching, almost unbearable need to understand why. His anger at Dante was fiery and relentless. But it was rooted not in hatred, but in betrayal, a betrayal so personal that it stripped away everything he thought he knew about family, truth, and love. Each time he searched for answers, he collided with conflicting voices, unspoken agendas, and half-hearted explanations that only deepened the fog in his mind. But through it all, one voice remained constant, Lois's. Her gentle counsel, her quiet certainty, gave Gio something to hold on to, even if that something was the conviction that Dante had never truly wanted him. Brooklyn. Drowning in guilt and desperation, tried to navigate the aftermath with grace, but her foundation was crumbling. She had always believed that the truth would set her free. That it would bring healing to her fractured family. But she had not anticipated the venomous undercurrents, the manipulation disguised as protection. Instead of leaning on Dante, her partner in this tragedy, she began to rely more and more on Lois, whose unwavering conviction masked a more dangerous motive. Lois seemed to understand. To offer clarity when everything else was chaos. Brooke Lynn, still reeling from the trauma of watching her son shatter on stage, sought solace in her mother's arms and listened without resistance. Slowly, she began to repeat the narrative Lois had been building, internalizing the belief that Dante's absence had triggered everything. In her grief, she stopped defending the man who had once stood beside her through fire, and that silence became the loudest blow of all. Lulu, ever the determined soul, fought to reclaim her place in the story. To explain that her actions, misguided though they were, had come from a place of love and urgency. But Lois had no room for grace where Lulu was concerned. To Lois, Lulu represented every reckless decision that had led to this fallout. She saw her as the woman who had brought chaos into her daughter's life, the catalyst for Dante's indecision. And the architect of Joe's public humiliation. No matter how many times Lulu tried to express remorse or seek understanding, Lois responded not with confrontation, but with pointed coldness. Every glance, every clipped word was laced with disdain, a slow, withering rejection that made it increasingly clear that Lulu would never be welcomed into the circle again, not by Lois, and through Lois's influence, not by Brooke Lynn or Gio either. The emotional exile was nearly complete. And then there was Dante, once a pillar of stability. Now a hollow man adrift in the wreckage of relationships he no longer knew how to repair. The people he had once fought for, bled for, and built his life around had all turned away, not with fury, but with apathy. That was what broke him. The slow fade of loyalty. The quiet retreat of trust. He had no one left to confide in. Every time he reached out, he was met with caution, defensiveness, or silence. It wasn't that they didn't love him, it was that they had come to believe, in the absence of his voice being truly heard, that he no longer deserved their faith. Even his attempts at atonement seemed to falter before they reached anyone's heart. Words fell flat. Apologies landed in silence. There were no shouts. No screaming confrontations, just a growing absence, as if Dante were slowly being erased from the story altogether. At the center of this carefully orchestrated emotional collapse stood Lois, serene, untouched, and utterly in control. She had not needed to scream, to fight, or to threaten. Her genius was in subtlety, in positioning herself as the constant while everyone else unraveled. She listened, observed, whispered truths no one wanted to say aloud. She leaned into old wounds, pressing just enough to keep them bleeding without ever being seen as the one causing pain. And as the final pieces of her plan fell into place, her victory was not loud or triumphant, it was chillingly quiet. A nod here. A knowing glance there. She never gloated. But she knew. She knew she had achieved what she set out to do. She had isolated Dante completely. Stripped him of allies, eroded his identity as a father, dismantled any hope of rekindled love with Lulu. And recast him as the architect of his own downfall in the eyes of those who once called him family. There was no formal confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just a systematic exile. Built brick by brick out of silence, misdirection, and half-truths. And as she stood in the wreckage she had shaped, watching the people she loved huddle together, closer than ever, yet further from Dante than they had ever been, Lois allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. Not a smile of cruelty. Not a smile of malice. But the smile of a woman who, after all these years, had finally taken back control. A woman who believed she had done what was necessary to protect her family. A woman who had no intention of letting Dante Falconeri ever hurt them again.